Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio, and joining me now is Greg Northey, Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Pulse Canada. Welcome here, Greg. I wish it was under better circumstances.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lindsay. And yeah, this is not great circumstances, that's for sure.
Absolutely not. Okay, so catch us up. I should note we are recording on Tuesday, the day the show will air. However, when we're dealing with labor disruptions, things can happen very quickly, and maybe that will be good news. But as we are speaking now, the Port of Vancouver under a lockout and strike, and as far as I understand it, so is the Port of Montreal. So let's start with how important are these two ports to pulse movement in Canada?
Yeah, so very important. So Montreal, so there's two terminals. So we're talking container terminals that are on strike. And then we've had the other two major terminals now are under embargo by the railways. So there's no strike at them, but traffic can't flow to them. So effectively, Montreal is shut down. And if we think about at least for pulse crops or the wider grain industry, there's about 3 million tons of grain that's exported in containers. And about a third of that goes through Montreal. And so the same ratio would be for pulses. We have about 500,000 tons of pulses that would go through Montreal. And importantly, the things that would go through Montreal, like beans, particularly, they only go through by container. We're not bulk shipping beans. And so at the moment, the only options are, Halifax, St. John, maybe Philadelphia. But right, effectively, that pipeline is shut down out of Montreal. So, a third to a half of all pulses and a third of all grain that moves in container out of Montreal has stopped.
So before we talk about Vancouver, one follow-up then to that. So you mentioned, there may be other options for some of this to go to, but that I'm going to assume adds time, adds costs, and I'm going to assume those ports are not necessarily as equipped to handle the volume. Like there's a reason we go through the Port of Montreal.
Yeah, for sure. And, exactly. There's a reason we go through Montreal. There's the facilities there. There's transloaders, et cetera, that are adept at handling grain, and, having to move to the eastern ports or into the US just creates a whole nother set of logistical challenges. And so nothing changes quickly. And we're talking very marginal amounts that could move through those other options. So it is a problem for sure.
And what about timing? Because, certainly from the Ontario perspective, IP beans, we know, go through Montreal. Yeah. A lot of them go very soon after harvest, if not at harvest, which just wrapped up. So timing wise, this seems to me like probably the worst or close to the worst time of year for this to be happening as well.
Yeah, pretty much, whether it's Montreal or Vancouver, which we can get to, but this is the time, when pulses or beans want to move, and it's a peak season. It's well known, and more recently, the big challenge for us has been logistical bottlenecks that have reduced sort of the amount, like our export programs, right? So we have enough that we could be moving more, but we can't, and now this obviously just creates a whole nother headache. And everything that needs to move is probably under contract. And as you start to miss those contracts, you start to pay more money and demurrage and everything else. And so labor is always an issue, but we're like a broken record here. But this is like this time of the year particularly is really problematic.
Right. Okay. Now, Port of Vancouver, but it's not just the Port of Vancouver. This is BC ports.
Yeah.
That means Prince Rupert as well. So that would be containerized traffic as well, is my understanding. So we did get news yesterday that the BC maritime employers have locked out staff, but the staff, of course, had also served strike notice. So similar to what we saw with the railway strike, we had a lockout and a strike happening simultaneously. But this impacts, of course, all the ports in BC. So, and as I mentioned, the railway strike, and of course, there was a port strike at Vancouver prior to this earlier in September. So where are we at as far as ports in Vancouver, generally speaking? Just how serious is this work stoppage?
Yeah, it's really serious. So the only thing that isn't affected is bulk grain movement.
Right.
But otherwise, everything that's going through Vancouver. So we're talking about the terminals that would be moving bulk potash and sulfur and everything else
Yeah.
have all shut down. Anything that's moving canola oil, for instance, would be closed. And then all the container terminals. So anything that's moving in container from pulses or grain is closed. And that's both in Vancouver and Prince Rupert. So and anything automotive,
Right.
pretty much everything other than bulk grain and cruise ships, is going to be impacted by this. And so obviously big impact. Like I said, Vancouver is half of what we would be exporting in containers moving through Vancouver. And then another portion of that, another, quarter would be going through Prince Rupert, roughly, about 2 million tons between the two ports, in a good year. Um, so, so yeah, it's a real problem. And, to put it in perspective at least from the Pulse perspective, we have things like peas that would be moving a lot of bulk, right? So
Right.
not as much container movement. Something like lentils, red lentils particularly, 50 to 60% of all red lentils would be moving in container. So those would not be moving. And then 100% of mustard, green lentils, green peas would be moving in container. And so,
Right.
it's disproportionately impacting the small, medium-sized exporters and farmers, right, who are growing those products because, quite literally, they're just not going to go anywhere if they were going to go through Vancouver. And the options out west are become very limited, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could maybe go into the US and try and get them out, but again, we're talking marginal opportunities. So it's a real problem.
So there's two parts I want to talk about on this. One closer to home, from the perspective of what Pulse Canada does, from the lobbying perspective of how important it is to keep traffic moving. What is happening right now are the conversations that the government needs to step in? Um, what are these conversations this week sounding like?
Yeah, I mean, we've been since last week, we've been speaking with government, sending many letters where we have letters we signed with coalitions of different groups. It's probably about five different letters from interested business groups that we've been a part of and sort of drawing attention to the issue. Part of the problem, I think, or at least last week, was there wasn't a ton of awareness about this, and even government was, not sure about the impact. And so it's been really important to at least raise the profile for one. Um, we are launching another campaign around this at stopthelockout.ca, and so because it's really important that we at least we found in these strikes, while it can be exhausting to do some of these things, because we're having to do them so often. Um, Having government hear from many people on how important this is really important. Um, and yeah, asking government to intervene is key here. One of the issues we're seeing with the Vancouver lockout is that the union there has been found by the Canadian Industrial Relations Board to be bargaining in bad faith on three different occasions, right? So there was a ruling by that board, 2 weeks ago saying bargaining is not happening in good faith, and so it's clear that those negotiations are broken, right? And so at that point, either government or anybody else saying there has to be a negotiated outcome, there has to be a negotiated outcome, it's not really clear there could ever be a negotiated outcome.
Right.
And so at that point, it's imperative for government to step in. They can either, back to work legislation, I think would be very difficult because I'm not sure there's, political support for that on the other parties. But they could certainly try and use the Section 107 tool that they use with the rail strike. But whatever they choose, I mean, we're asking for all those things, but it has to happen quickly because the longer this goes on, the more damaging it becomes.
Hmm. Well, and as you mentioned, obviously incredibly detrimental for containerized traffic for pulses and those crops that move that way. But you mentioned fertilizer. We have parts potentially coming and going. This doesn't just have an impact on pulses, but it also doesn't just have an impact on agriculture. Like this is the entire country, and the average consumer that this potentially impacts the longer it goes on. So at the same time, I'm just going to put it out there. It's not like Parliament is very functional right now. So
Yeah.
I can only imagine how difficult it is to get the ear of the people that you need when Parliament isn't really even functioning right now.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. Everyone's sort of focused on other things that arguably probably aren't and as important as this because absolutely the impact on for people. I mean, we talk about pulses and grain, but you're right. Automotive, everything is going to be
Yeah.
impacted by this. Anything that's coming in and for the retail sector, fresh fruit and vegetables is always a time of year when we start to see a lot of citrus
Yeah.
from various parts of the world, and that stuff's perishable. It's all not going to make it in, and so
Mhm.
the impacts are very broad and will be significant on Canadians, and so
Mhm.
getting the attention of politicians around that is surprisingly hard at this
Yeah.
point.
Which means anyone who hears this, call your MP. Just throwing that out there.
Yes.
But also looking then, so that's inward, but looking outward. This is, probably this year, the fifth, sixth time we've had this conversation about Canada as a reliable supplier to the world. I cannot imagine that it is a easy conversation to have with our customers overseas again and again and again. So what do we hear from our customers who are expecting this product at a certain time, who potentially are having to be told, sorry, we can't get it to you?
Yeah, it's at this point it's just disappointment. We because and it's disappointing for them, but it's also obviously disappointing for our sectors and our exporters and our businesses that rely on transportation where we have a great product, but it's clear right now that Canada's reputation is severely damaged, and it becomes difficult in contracts. Contracts are signed that we're not able to execute on, and it starts to impact price. It impacts all kinds of things around. If I'm going to buy from Canada, what's the premium I need to add to account for the fact that I may actually not get the product that I expect to buy, and so. It's a real problem, and it's clear, at least from our perspective, that our labor code and everything to do with labor right now needs a really solid rethink,
Mhm.
because we can't continue in this cycle as the Canadian agriculture sector or any other sector in Canada.
Mhm. And that I guess is perhaps where we sort of end on is, from the perspective of when we follow through all of these labor issues, oftentimes it's a 2-year agreement gets signed, a 3-year, a 4-year. So the deadlines for some of these labor issues is known well in advance, but we do seem to get to this point where, and this year has been sort of this absolute just convergence of so many overdue contracts, workers without contracts, etc., that, all of this came to a head, like the dual strike at the railway, all at the same time. How do we get ahead of this? Like, how do we actually, as a country, put together something that says, we have to have a functional logistics system, and here's how we're going to get there? Who leads that?
Yeah, well, I mean that's a great question because we have more labor agreements expiring at the end of this year that I think are going to impact us next year, and so the cycle will continue. Yeah, so one of the things that we're looking at, and yeah, and this is born from this frustration where, every time this happens, increasingly we're not necessarily caught unawares. Like before, we always weren't sure when these things were ending, but now the information on when deals end and what the timelines could look like, we're much more aware. But the reality is when they do happen,
Mhm.
the tools we have are pretty limited. It's campaigns, it's asking for back to work legislation, it's Section 107. It's always band-aid solutions, quite frankly, and it's something that we're going to be looking at. So the grain sector through many in the grain sector have agreed to actually start a project that we're going to be kicking off this month, where we're going to actually start to look at hiring subject matter experts around labor law and start to look at what are those things. And to your point, it could be around what's the runway to this deal expiring? Are we hitting certain checkpoints where
Mhm.
the proper things are being negotiated? Are we able to negotiate certain things quickly to get them out of the way? And then for the real, because I mean, if one thing we see is that negotiations are as contentious as ever, right?
Yeah.
The two sides just are not really able, don't, and many of these deals just aren't able to sit down and actually negotiate something in good faith ahead of time. And so, what are the things we can start to build into the process to ensure that both sides continue to have their rights under the labor code, but we are hitting certain check marks where you need to see some progress on these negotiations to prevent these last minute strikes and lockouts from happening. And I think there's probably plenty of room to start to look at that and to build it in to provide that kind of certainty. And then, in the cases where there's clearly, around automation or something where they're just never going to come together,
Mhm.
is there a way to siphon that directly into binding arbitration so that you don't need to go through a strike or a lockout on that
Yeah.
particular issue? It's clear it's not going to be negotiated. And so let's get both best offers on the table and start to deal with it. Anyways, there's a whole suite of options, and I
Yeah.
think, beyond just looking at essential service or things like that, I think that's a very difficult political reach. But within the process itself, what does it look like? So we're going to be
Mhm.
starting that, and hopefully in the next couple of months, the grain sector will start to have like real solutions for that, and then we can shop them around to other sectors. But
Mhm.
that's where leadership starts. I think it's being clear from the grain sector we need to actually take charge of this and start to defend our industry in a more focused way.
Mhm. All right. Greg, I hope that by the time this goes to air, this is all resolved. But as we've highlighted, even if the strike at Montreal or Vancouver is solved, we are not out of the woods, of course. With logistics, one day of strike does not equal one day, and everything's back to normal. So the longer this drags on, the larger impact it has, regardless. So we'll see. But keep us posted, and I look forward to seeing what the green industry puts together as far as solutions, because this is just too important to leave to chance. That's for sure. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.